Thank you, Wilma, for that introduction. I've been thinking about this talk for a long time and struggling with what to say in this moment and given the events of the last year. I had originally been thinking I would focus this talk on democracy, and I spent some time reading the works of various political scientists and philosophers on the linkages between political and economic democracy, something I've long been interested in. But as I shifted my reading in some new areas and thought more about all the events of the past year, I headed in a different direction. I started with the idea that we, as members of the LERA community, as professionals in the field of employment relations, and as human beings, are facing numerous crises. I was inspired in part to think about multiple crises by the introduction to the 2021 LERA research volume, Revaluing Workers Toward a Democratic and Sustainable Future, which was written by my Rutgers colleagues Toby Schultz-Cleven and Todd Vachon. First and foremost in our minds, the thing that continues to keep us apart for this conference is the pandemic. The pandemic has upended work, the institution of central concern that LERA revolves around. With the shutdowns in March of 2020, the pandemic crisis quickly became an employment and work crisis. As I said to a student newspaper reporter around that time, people were either working from home, many of whom had never done so before, working unsafely, or not working. And many of those who were not working, and maybe are still not working, were or are wondering about where their next meal was going to come from. I think here especially of the undocumented among us, who have little or no access to the social safety net. Here are some quotes from undocumented workers in New York City, most from the spring of 2020. Well, in the case of my family, we are very scared because we had the loss of my brother who died from the coronavirus, and everyone is scared by this pandemic that we have had to live in isolation, without work, without money, and with great fear. It is impacting us financially, emotionally. There is sadness, worry, fear, and anguish among my children because of the fact that we, their parents, could die. We, as parents, we are concerned about financial insecurity and not knowing when we will return to work. I'm worried because my dad lost his job and my mom is the only one working. She's working at a laundromat. She's risking her health to work, and I'm scared my parents will get sick because they are also undocumented. There were days I couldn't sleep, to be honest with you. We had nothing. Returning now to my own voice. Under the former administration, OSHA refused to do anything about workplace safety, though some states did, including my own. The federal government expanded the definition of eligibility for unemployment insurance and increased the payments. But many states, either purposefully or a result of poor IT systems or both, had enormous troubles implementing these changes. Healthcare workers improvised protective equipment and new clinical spaces. Many worked unsafely and some died. 3,600 in the U.S. alone, according to estimates by the Kaiser Health News and The Guardian. All these topics and more have provided challenges and lessons in the world of practice and a rich world to study for those of us who do research, however ghoulish that might sound. And research is already emerging from those with the time and energy to do it. Perhaps this entire talk should be dedicated to work and the pandemic. But I thought maybe we might all be a bit tired of it, honestly. So then there is climate change, an existential threat to us all, and one that is demonstrated in last year's conference. A theme around sustainability touches many areas in which we work, from green jobs to just transitions to immigration and immigrant workers and beyond. It's a hard topic to center in the day-to-day work that many of us do, and yet it looms over everything. As an aside, I want to mention my favorite quote that links climate change and the world of labor and employment relations. I first heard it from Sharon Burrow, the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. But in Googling around, I learned that someone named Judy Bonds is often credited with saying it first. Judy was a coal miner's daughter and an environmental activist in West Virginia, which can help you imagine the context for that quote. She died of cancer in 2011. The quote is, "There are no jobs on a dead planet." And by the way, I've also seen the quote adapted to, "There is no business on a dead planet." And I suppose we could say there are no publications and no tenure on a dead planet either. Our field needs to grow in its engagement with this crisis, no matter the particular work we each do. Then there are the interrelated crises of inequality, racism, and democracy. The impact of both the pandemic and climate change have been and will continue to be felt unequally and have exacerbated inequalities of multiple kinds, both within the U.S. and globally, as we can see now with the vaccine rollout. I believe our field has been centrally concerned with some kinds of inequality since its founding. The inequality of power between workers and capital, or managers if you prefer, what we might call class inequality. I think we've been less focused on racial inequality, and we've been called to task for that by my colleague Tammy Lee and her co-author Maita Tapia, among others. I strongly urge you to read their paper, Confronting Race and Other Social Identity Erasures, The Case for Critical Industrial Relations Theory, in the May 2021 special issue on Theory in Industrial and Labor Relations Review. It may raise more questions for you than give answers, but that's a good thing, especially for the field. I'm not sure I agree with everything that Tammy and Maita say in their paper, and I don't think I completely understand all of it, but I know we need to absorb the argument, sit with it, think about what it means for our own work, whether that work is research and teaching or practice in the field. I'm proud that the 2022 LERA research volume is being edited by Maita and Tammy, along with two other Rutgers faculty members, Naomi Williams and Cherie Davis. The title of that volume is Industrial Relations and a Racial Reckoning, and I look forward to seeing it. Personally, I am very drawn to the argument that we actually cannot and should not separate race and class. I've been very interested in the work of Ian Haney-Lopez in this regard and have been trying to find time to read his book, Merge Left. Haney-Lopez is a law professor at UC Berkeley, where he studies and writes on politics. He's the author of a book on racial dog whistles. I'm going to assume you know what those are. The subtitle of his newer book is Fusing Race and Class, Winning Elections and Saving America. Who doesn't want to win elections and save America? I highly recommend the book, which, of interest to this audience, starts with the story of a visit he paid to an annual retreat of a national union's leadership in Florida. It's an interesting story. He argues that racism is fundamentally a class weapon, one used by moneyed interests to misdirect white working class people about who or what is to blame for the rampant inequality they are experiencing, along with working class people of color. In a way, this message isn't terribly new, and I confess here that I'm not that deep into the book yet. In this case, it's rooted in a lot of polling and survey research, and Haney-Lopez is all about using his findings to produce better political and organizing messaging. Turning to inequality and its relationship to threats to democracy, I was also inspired by reading Kathy Thalen's presidential address to the American Political Science Association, titled The American Precariat, U.S. Capitalism and Comparative Perspective, and published in 2019. It is quite interesting, though not surprising for those of us who know Professor Thalen's work, that her talk is really centered on topics that we focus on at LERA, what she labels atypical employment, and some of us would prefer to call informal employment or even precarious employment. She shows a series of graphs and charts. Some of her graphs are focused just within the United States, showing the nature of class inequality. Here's one example. It shows access to paid sick leave, and I picked it in part because this became such a huge issue during the pandemic. The left side shows the decline over time by different occupation groups, with the lowest access always for production workers, and the steep decline among technical and clerical workers. The chart on the right is access by income quartile, which is pretty self-explanatory. The other set of charts in the piece show a series of comparisons between Europe and the US, mostly relying on OECD data. Let me show you a couple of those, although again, I'm sure these will not be shocking to many of you. I can say that these kinds of comparisons are often shocking to Rutgers students. The first shows statutory paid time off, both for vacations and holidays. The US is over there on the right with 0. The second is not from Thalen's talk. I found this in an article in the magazine Fast Company. Yeah, we're over there on the right again, mostly red, meaning least generous, unemployment insurance, parental entitlements, annual leave and holidays, and sick pay. Again, these benefits rose in importance during the pandemic and continue to be so. For instance, in a recent Kaiser Family Foundation poll on vaccine hesitancy, 21% of unvaccinated workers said they'd be more likely to get the vaccine if their employer provided paid time off to both get the vaccine and recover from any side effects. I also want to mention here a recent MBER study summarized in May 28th story in the New York Times. This study shows how women's labor force participation fell compared to men's in 18 out of 28 countries in North America and Europe, with the greatest gaps in the US and Canada. These gaps were a function of school closures, which were longest in the US and Canada, lack of a robust childcare system, but also gaps in other labor market policies like the use of furloughs and the differential impact of telecommuting on work at home. I'm not going to speak to gender again in this talk, but I want to highlight here how important a gendered lens can be to our research, as demonstrated in this paper, which contrasts what the authors call the pandemic-induced she session versus earlier man sessions and the differing policy implications of these different events. I also want to note that the issues facing women workers discussed in this paper are pervasive in higher education, creating inequities that are frankly without good answers, or at least ones that most of our institutions can easily afford. Back now to my charts, or rather Thalen's charts. The third chart is again from Thalen's paper. It presents union density and coverage, a perennial favorite for us. The data are a little old, but I don't think anything has changed fundamentally. The US is over there, close to the edge again, although this time it's the left edge. Only close because our union density is actually higher than France's. Union coverage, of course, tells a different story. Thalen sums up, quote, "All the rich democracies are experiencing a shared problem of growing contingency and precarity. However, it seems fair to say that the problem of precarity presents itself with special intensity in the United States," end quote. She also links political democracy to economic democracy and the need for political science as a discipline to study macro-political economy and not just voting behavior and individual attitudes. Thalen's concern with democracy brings me to another presidential address, that of Paula Voos to LERA, well, actually IRRA, in 2003. Paula's address was on democracy and industrial relations. Her first sentence reads, "Political democracy is thriving in the world." Things seem to have changed. To be fair, she goes on to say that, quote, "Democracy may be doing well in the world, but is not doing well in the United States," end quote, citing low rates of voting and particularly lower rates for those with lower incomes. Both Voos and Thalen argue that income and wealth inequality constitute threats to democracy, with Voos emphasizing the ways unions can strengthen democracy, not just by encouraging voting, but also through reducing inequality. Schulz-Clevin and Vachon's introduction also discusses the links between precarity and status anxiety and openness to right-wing populism. As does Guy Standing in the very title of his well-known book, the precariat, the new dangerous class. My point here is that the concerns of our field, focused on employment, have important implications for the crisis of democracy. As Thalen calls for political science to consider macro-political economy and the institutions of employment, perhaps our field needs to spend more time considering the implications of work and employment on political institutions and politics. Returning to Thalen's address, she also argues cause and effect, saying, unions have been the key protagonist in expanding social protections and reducing inequality. Further, quote, one of the most robust findings in the literature on comparative political economy is that the strength of the organized labor movement is associated with lower inequality, especially low-end inequality, and more generous social protections, end quote. Moose points to lower voting rates among those with lower incomes as another explanation for our poor social safety net and labor laws. But I wonder whether there isn't a different cause of poor social protections in the United States and low unionization rates. And this brings me back to our racial reckoning and to the second book I want to talk about. This book is The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, who happens to be an Ian Haney Lopez student. Where do I even start with this searing and necessary book? McGee's central argument is that we are all harmed by white racism, and especially by the related zero-sum notion held by many white people that if people of color, especially black people, have more of something, that means they have less. According to McGhee, the zero sum is a story sold by wealthy interests for their own profit, and its persistence requires people desperate enough to buy it. Further, she argues, quote, the narrative that white people should see the well-being of people of color as a threat to their own is one of the most powerful subterranean stories in America. Until we destroy the idea, opponents of progress can always unearth it and use it to block any collective action that benefits us all, end quote. The book walks us through the history of the zero-sum lie. I'm going to call it a lie in the spirit of the book. Starting with a look at the period of 1680s and early 1700s, which she calls a deliberate effort to legislate a new hierarchy between poor whites and unwhite natives and African laborers. McGhee points out, like Thalen, differences between the U.S. and Europe. Quote, when it comes to per capita government spending, the U.S. is near the bottom of the list of industrial countries, below Latvia and Estonia. With the exception of about 40 years from the New Deal to the 1970s, the U.S. has had a weaker commitment to public goods and to the public good than every country that possesses anywhere near our wealth. End of quote. She talks about how the public goods of the so-called Golden Age in the United States, starting with the New Deal itself, including unions and the NLRA, moving through the implementation of the GI Bill, if not its design, to the investment in highways that made suburbs possible. These were all predicated on segregated access to these goods. She tells the story of public swimming pools, and this story, told on a radio broadcast or podcast, was my original introduction to this book. She starts with the glory years of pool building starting in the 1920s, leading eventually to the fight to desegregate public pools. But with desegregation, many public pools were actually privatized or heartbreakingly filled in. And the point of the pool story is that now no one who needed a public pool, including poor and working-class whites, got to have a pool anymore. The idea that race is at the core of why the U.S. has fewer public goods, less of a social safety net, fewer protective labor laws, and a lower rate of collective bargaining is not new to me, but McGhee has done an important job in systematically documenting it. It is something our field needs to grapple with, whether through a critical race theory lens, as Lee and Tapia have argued, or some other theoretical perspective. I've long been a big fan of the Sandy Jacoby book chapter in his 1991 edited book, Master to Managers. The chapter is titled American Exceptionalism Revisited: The Importance of Management. It seems high time for someone to write a new piece with the title American Exceptionalism Revisited: The Importance of Race. I have meandered on long enough. I will simply conclude by repeating that our world is facing multiple interrelated crises. Our field can be at the center of responding to these multiple crises through our research, teaching, service, and practice. Indeed, it must be to survive and prosper. More importantly, these crises must be faced if we are to survive and prosper as human beings. But we need to be intentional about it, and we need to expand the range of voices we hear, including those of the workers we study, advocate for, and manage, including those who are most marginalized, like the workers I quote at the beginning of the talk. Thank you.